Once I dreamt I was a butterfly. I forgot myself and only knew my happiness as a butterfly. Soon I awoke, and I was myself again. Did I dream that I was a butterfly? Or did I now dream that I am a man? Yet there is a distinction between myself and the butterfly. This is the transformation of the physical. Is the opening to Shin Megami Tensei Persona, or Revelation Persona in the West. Though just don't look at Mark too hard. It's a game that follows 8 high school students after they are summoned to another world. The world of Maki Samura.
What is... Huh? It's too late now to ask to... Whoa!
Help me.
What the... Yukino!
A girl who's been stuck in the hospital for the last 6 months, and we find out later is divided into 4. The girl in white, the one we see in the beginning, the girl in black, the one we see mostly throughout the whole game, the character we play with the most, her ideal self, Maki, and her final form, and ultimately the epitome of her nihilism, Pandora. These 4 are, of course, the fragmented pieces of the whole person, and while we can leave with a positive message of people are great together, what is also true, however, when looking from Pandora, is that it can go both ways. While we can argue that Maki was ultimately the victim of manipulation and was extremely vulnerable in where she was, we also cannot absolve her from the consequences of the choices that she did make, and the game makes us ultimately aware of this. Throughout the game, we slowly are given pieces about why this world was created as it was, and who was part of this world. Some of them were just friends or people that she cared about, but then there's also people that were missing, like her mother. In the beginning of the game, we see her ultimately dismiss and not even want to be around her own mother. This is, of course, can be a very common thing that happens to people as they get older and realize that the parents can only do so much for them. As Carl Jung would remark, when a child reaches school age, the phase of building up the ego and of adapting to the outer world begins. This phase generally begins a number of painful shocks. At the same time, some children begin to feel very different from others. And this feeling of uniqueness brings a certain sadness that is part of the loneliness of many. The imperfections of the world and of the evil within oneself as well as the outside become conscious problems. The child must try to cope with urgent but yet not yet understood inner impulses as well as the demands of the outer world. If this development of consciousness is disturbed in its normal unfolding, children frequently retire from the outer or inner difficulties into an inner fortress. Thus, part of the unconscious consists of a multitude of temporary, obscure thoughts, impressions, and images that, in spite of being lost, continue to influence our conscious mind.
Where'd the rope go?
This idea can range from the people that she decided to bring into her own world unconsciously, or in the fact that the police station and the hospital have been turned into a forest and the castle, respectively. This is slightly hinted at in the beginning when the ideal Maki meets us for the first time when we're trying to get through the hole, and I comments that Maki is unusually chipper and in a good mood, rather than in the more begrudging mood that she would be in the hospital that she's been in for such a long time. I also think that ultimately, that what we see in this game, Maki has become both an extremely lonely person and someone who has become emotionally stunted by the absence of her parents. While we never get reference to her father at all, what we do get of her mother is that her mother is mostly absent except when she does arrive home to see Maki every blue moon, which by the end of the game is resolved, but is ultimately something that became a key factor upon the original downfall of everyone else. Of course, the other major contributor to this was Kendori himself, the president of SPEC. However, to say that Kendori was completely and totally responsible for this would also be ignoring the fact that Maki, in some way, shape, or form, wanted this. towards the end of the game, we do get that Maki was in fact a jealous person who wanted to not feel the same way that she did, and did so by bringing everyone else down. Unconsciously, yes, and maybe unwillingly when you look at it at the fact that she was manipulated into this decision. However, even Maki does not accept this fact and ultimately does in fact take responsibility for the actions that she took. And this is one of the many reasons why I find Maki Samura to be such a compelling character, as she's not made to be someone who has made a decision easily, or someone who necessarily even wants to make this choice in the first place, but rather someone who slowly has to actually confront their own soul with both its beauty and ultimate ugliness that eventually transforms into something greater than it was before. But throughout the game, we are always given a sense that no matter who you are, the journey will be just a hair rough. And this can ultimately also be true for Kandori himself. Kandori, for all intents and purposes, is an extremely ambitious man. While the game does note this, on the brink of nihilism pretty much throughout the entire game from beginning to end, somehow still does not let that completely absorb him until the very end, while only the head of the department, and we never really know how much actual theory work he puts into this. One thing that's known for sure is that if he was not there, this project would have not been as far as it was now. And ultimately someone who can succumb to the crushing weight of all of that. While we can ultimately look at Kandori as simply a extremely rich, wealthy, and well-positioned man in society, we can also look at him for what he is. Someone who's ultimately lost his reason and has no longer figured out that sometimes in life there is no next big step forward, but rather just a coastline, and maybe figuring it out from there. But ultimately, some people choose not to get absorbed by this, and instead double down in this emptiness. And ultimately, Kandori does get eaten away by this. And even if he does die in the end, in peace, knowing that even if he died without purpose in his own mind, the people that took him down had reason enough to go through his own nihilism. And that nihilism was ultimately the thing that needed to push Maki finally through the edge to meet herself. Maybe her friends were always ultimately going to be the thing to help her along, but if it was not for this, the removal of the thing that was ultimately giving her the comfort in the most morbid way possible, then it's pretty easy to say that Pandora could have evolved to be something worse. And for better or worse, Maki eventually faces the fact that Kandori was someone who was deeply important to her, and that she has made a lot of choices because of him. And by the end of the game, she chooses to face that fact head on. A friend who we find originally tries to tear down Maki, and pretty thoroughly, I will say. That's pretty harsh, I will have to say. Anyways, what's ultimately important here is that while Chasto, seeming like a two-faced friend, is more honestly a reflection of Maki's choices of the people she chose to be around. While yes, the majority of the people she chose around were ultimately just maybe normal people, nicer people more or less, what we do see in her choice of best friend being Chasto, ultimately like an unconscious moth to a light, what we see is Maki unknowingly gravitate towards people who have a double life. Kandori being an extremely ambitious man, the head of the company, but yet suffering greatly from nihilism. Chasto, a good friend of Maki, but ultimately someone who was there to tear her down towards the end, and only was able to see through her own pain when Maki was able to go through her. And Maki herself. Yes, in the game, we see her ideal self being nice and kind. It is also very apparent that in her waking life, she may be not as terrible as we could believe. She's ultimately someone who was gloomy and maybe just hard to be around. And that's important to keep in mind. And something the game also keeps in mind, and something that Maki herself is ashamed of, and something that we, the player, and her friends ultimately help her get through, is that yes, sometimes we all have ugly times in our lives, but that shouldn't stop us from ultimately helping helping each other and leaning on one another when needed. And the game shows us this. Even Nejiro, an extremely pessimistic man, what we ultimately get is someone who's still willing to help the people around him, and helping Maki even if he uses the harshest words, but the words that she needed at that point. And a mark of a true friend is not someone who is just kind to you, not just someone who's going to be there for you, but someone who's willing to be there and look in you and look into your own soul and tell you back to you that is in fact kind of ugly, and that's okay. And ultimately that's the game's message, is that no matter how ugly your soul is, no matter how beautiful you wish it could be, ultimately what's more important is that you take responsibility for yourself and those you choose to be around. Is that we're here together, and the only way we're going to figure this out is if we stick along together. And the game does this in a smart way. The few times that the party does split off, like when Mark and Nejiro split off when they originally get the security card, and Mark gets himself caught, now he has to reach to the rest of the group to get help. The most poignant of times for this example would obviously be at the end of the game when you finally kill Kandori and Maki finally sees her true selves, that being Aki, Mai later on, and the real Maki, who's in the hospital and whose soul is eventually found in the Sea of Soul and must be retrieved once again. One of the more important pieces when getting the good or bad ending of the game is whether you tell Mai to hide or not. This is ultimately because Mai is, for all intents and purposes, the ego of Maki. Aki is said to be the id, and I think then, but for all intents and purposes, Mai is her ego, which would make sense. She is the more childish version of Maki, someone who is more reflective of her, someone who's afraid, possibly of getting hurt, someone who does want, in fact, people to be around her and like help her, but someone who's more afraid of revealing that and would rather hide in the lost forest, somewhere around in a gingerbread house. If you tell her to keep hiding, eventually you get the bad end of the game, and forcibly take the compact for her, but ultimately destroying her, and eventually the ideal Maki destroys Aki and forces everyone else out, and herself into the real Maki, versus in the good ending. Instead, you continue the game afterwards, and instead of fighting Mai, the ideal Maki, after you confront her and her confrontation with the nihilism and being absorbed by Pandora, ultimately being saved by the party and her mother there, comfort her once again. The ideal Maki finally rejoining with her real mother and accepting this fact, finally confronts the real Maki in the Sea of Souls in Alaya's shrine, and ultimately tells her that she needs to stop being a coward, and that yet she has made choices, and yes, sometimes there's things we could have done that could have been better, but now it's a time to live and to make rights wrong now. Not the fact that you can change them now, but because you choose to try now to change. The ultimate battle with Pandora is both the representation of her finally molding the clay, which is Pandora, into whatever shape that she finally chooses it to be, and her philosophical fight, and ultimately her choice to not be absorbed by nihilism and to push forward to find another way through it, which is represented through the transformation of the butterfly. If the original form of Pandora was her ultimate nihilism, the butterfly was in fact the possible transformation into the new greater soul that she had hidden within her. After defeating Pandora, he accepts Pandora and all the other versions of Maki that she had hidden within herself, kicks out the party, leaves you, and eventually you all make it back to the real world, where Maki is found to finally see the recovered self out of the hospital, smiling, not because she's faking it, but because she's finally confronted the deep darkness within her own soul. It is thus to say one thing: Maki is neither a flawed character nor a perfect character. She is, by I think the greatest definition, a whole character. Something which I find to be very difficult to deliver. And while the game can be sometimes a little rudimentary, and I sometimes will also feel that when I'm grinding that for many hours, sweet God. What is ultimately true is that it shows that Maki is not just a complex character, but in fact shows her complete and wholeness, and something which sadly gets lost in the later games, but something that in the second game